Hello and welcome to the Save Our Sperrins podcast, Voices from the Frontline. This podcast comes from the Sperrin Mountains in Northern Ireland. It's a place shaped by land, by community and by long memory. And it's now living with growing pressure from mining and large-scale upland development. That pressure isn't unique to here. Across the world, the so-called energy transition is driving ever more extraction. There's growing demand for critical minerals and rare earth metals. And that demand is landing on local communities, asking them to live with the long-term impacts of toxic mining. Season 1 looked at why the Sperrin Mountains matter through the voices of the people who live here and know this place well. Season 2 keeps those local voices at the centre while also stepping back a bit. In Season 2, we look at extractivism more broadly, how it's been justified, how it is fundamental to a system of accelerated growth, plundering ever more from a finite planet, designed only to feed predatory capitalism, creating untold and unprecedented misery simply to support the bottom line of a balance sheet in some distant glass-walled boardroom far from the ground that we stand on. Thanks for listening, and let's begin. My guests today are Alessandra Accogli and Elena Aitova. Alessandra works in environmental and climate law with particular focus on how peatlands are treated within planning and climate policy. She authored a report on the Dalradian gold mining application that looked closely at how peatland extraction sat alongside stated climate commitments and where there were gaps and inconsistencies between policy language and what was actually being proposed on the ground. Her work sits in the difficult space where climate targets, legal obligations and real places collide, looking at how effective policy protection is when there is unrelenting pressure for development and growth. Elena Aitova is a PhD researcher working on greenhouse gas emissions from the Irish raised bogs. Her scientific work focuses on measuring carbon emissions directly and the impact of rewetting and restoring degraded peatlands. She also drafted the peatland rebuttal for Save Our Sperrins, bringing that scientific understanding into the planning process and helping translate measurements and monitoring into evidence that could be used publicly and legally. Hello, Alessandra and Elena. You are very welcome to the podcast. Alessandra, could you tell us a little about yourself and your work? And then, Elena, I'll come to you after that.
Yes, I can do that. And so I'm based in Dublin. So I'm currently in Dublin and I've been living in Dublin for 5 years. So I actually came to Ireland from Italy. I'm originally Italian and I came to Ireland to start my PhD. So to do my PhD in law at the UCD Sutherland School of Law. And so that kept me busy for the past 4 years. And then after that, I started working in DCU as a postdoctoral researcher and currently also teaching assistant lecturer. Yeah, so that's me now. So I'm working in DCU and mainly working on climate change, law and policy, and human rights law as well. Those are my fields of research and work. So that's me in a nutshell, basically.
What attracted you into that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So before actually coming to Ireland, I wasn't in Italy, I was in Belgium. So I did my undergraduate studies in Italy, but then I moved to Belgium to continue kind of with work and also studies. So in Belgium, I first was working with an NGO, but then I just felt I needed to go back to studying and I did 2 masters there. And one of these was on political science and then public international law, actually, these two. When I was studying there as part of as well as working, I just became really interested in the cause of climate change. That would have been 2018, 2019. And I think just the debate around climate change was really interesting at the time. It was still, there was still uncertain. So there was still voices kind of questioning whether, the science was consensual or whether there was enough science. But then there were also people and scholars and researchers, as well as activists and other organizations kind of calling for action. And so I just was intrigued by how the law could have been made better. What was the problem? What was lacking in the law, or what was the role of the law in addressing climate change? So that's how I got to be wanting to kind of dig into that. And that's how I felt I really wanted to do research. And then, then I started the PhD.
And which part do you find the most interesting? The point of view of the role of the law, or the arguments about climate change, which attracts you most? Which speaks to you most? Or is that a fair question? But perhaps it's equal. And
I think I just brought the two aspects together because of my background. So my background would have been in law. So I think in thinking about climate change, I would bring my own kind of a perspective as a legal scholar now. Well, at the time I was just a law student, but so I think I just, I used the lens that I knew the most, so the legal kind of lens, to see whether the law could, how the law addressed the problem in the first place, and maybe how it could be made better, or whether there was an issue with the legal response to climate change. So I think I just brought them together myself because of my background. Yeah.
Okay. And final sort of little question on this. As you were growing up, had you much awareness, or when you were a younger woman, were you aware of climate change, as we call it, the climate emergency at this stage, or has that become more prevalent for you?
No, I think it has become really prevalent when I moved to Belgium. I think there was much more awareness. It just as a question of time, it was a different time, but also I come from a small place and small village in the south of Italy. I just don't think even now that the awareness that I have here in Ireland, in Dublin, is a bit different than back home. There is much more awareness even there, but I don't know if it's just a question of being related or linked to certain institutions and the work I do and all of that. But no, I think I grew up with that awareness later on. I didn't remember growing up with the awareness of climate change. No.
Okay. So let's move it on a little bit. Can you explain to the listener how peatlands are protected by law in the Republic of Ireland? Just a general overview. You don't have to go into huge detail.
Yes, for sure. So what I say all the time when I'm asked this question is the idea that maybe, the first thing is that we need to understand that there isn't just maybe one law, one legal instrument that is applicable to peatlands, but it's kind of a constellation. So I did this kind of in my research, this mapping of different laws that apply to peatlands. And first of all, the main one would be the main legal instrument would be the EU Habitats Directive, because that provides for designation of protected areas in the Republic of Ireland. And then, so these areas are designated, and the goal is to kind of preserve these natural features so that they can, we can enjoy them for present and the future. And then another important piece of legislation is the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, which basically provides for an assessment of the significant impacts that a specific project or plan can have on the environment. So as you can imagine then, especially the Habitats Directive with the designation of protected areas has created this divide between designated and non-designated peatlands. And then the level of protection is different as well, because designated peatlands would have a stronger level of protection. It basically, the main implication of this is limiting land use activities that can happen on the land then. And just to keep in mind that obviously these laws were adopted with, they didn't have the idea of peatlands as carbon sinks in mind. So peatlands as essential for mitigating climate change. They were mainly, the goal of those laws was mainly to protect biodiversity and protect peatlands as natural habitats. And then more recently, peatlands have begun to be seen as important carbon sinks, so as absorbing and storing carbon, and so as essential also for climate mitigation. And that led to another system of protection with targets to be achieved, and restoration targets and climate targets as well. So I can go in detail into that if you want me to, but that's kind of an overview on a general level.
And do you feel, in relation to the law, that the peatlands are adequately protected right now, or have you an opinion on that?
It's a good question. The problem essentially with the law, especially in relation to my experience with the Republic of Ireland, is the lack of enforcement. So even if the law was there in terms of the designation of protected areas, the enforcement has been lacking in a sense that, still, let's say, land use activities that weren't supposed to happen, continue to happen, in terms of, I especially looked at peat extractions, both from an industrial and domestic perspective. So they continue to happen, and it's been difficult to lead to the cessation of those activities. And sometimes, the problem is also related to how the law has been implemented, with lack of maybe involvement and consultation of, people felt they have been kind of left behind in that kind of application of the EU law to the national level. So there is also an element of, how things are done in terms of implementing the law. But I would say that it's mainly a kind of a lack of enforcement and taking different considerations into account when you implement the law. So not just the fact that you're trying to protect the ecosystem as natural habitat, but also maybe considering what was there before doing that. So, obviously there were people involved and people interacting with the ecosystem. So it's important. And that's kind of the approach and I try to promote in the research, to consider this ecosystem as holistic space. And so also the response has to be a bit more holistic and consider different interests at stake.
Yeah, I often notice there's quite a bit of resistance to traditional methods of removing traditional methods of harvesting turf in the bog. There are some people who want to continue it because they see it as a traditional right. And I suppose when they were footing turf using a spade is a completely different animal from using tractor and cutting, as we used to call it, maggot turf, the big long rows of it. Is there still much resistance around the country to the removal of that right to cut turf? Are some people still allowed to cut it, and do they have to cut it by hand, or where does that? Do you know? Perhaps you don't know about that.
Yeah, I think there is still resistance in terms of domestic turf cutting. Certainly the practice has changed, as you were pointing out, that is no longer just hand cutting practices, but more like being cut by machinery, oftentimes by contractors on behalf of the people with the turbary rights, with the right to cut turf. But then, still it is considered pretty much a traditional activities or a cultural practice in terms of then, the stacking and the drying of the peat is done still in a kind of a traditional way. So what I've done, I did look into this, the domestic, the dimension of catching turf for domestic purposes, so for household fuel in my research. And I did, I used, and I don't know if that's of interest, but I did try to see if this cultural practice can fall within the scope of a human right to take part in cultural life under international law.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what I came down to is that, I kind of devised this different criteria that can be applied to see whether that's the case. So there is a collective dimension, this place-based dimension, the temporal dimension, and this collective meaning dimension. And, the breaking point for me was precisely the purpose for which the caching is done. So whether it is for domestic use or whether it is for commercial, so selling the peat on a big scale, and often associated with black market and with the use of this black economy sometimes. So that's where kind of it was the breaking point of where it didn't really match then with the cultural understanding of the practice.
In the Republic of Ireland as well, it's not so much about cutting peat for heating the houses. Now it's about cutting peat for horticulture.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of getting bigger and bigger issue, and a bigger proportion of peat are cut for this rather than for the houses. And it's interesting to look on this issue from completely different direction.
Uh-huh.
For the houses. So it's not about cutting peat, it's about keeping warm in winter. And this could be done in different ways. So we can tackle this problem from different direction, provide people grants for upgrading their houses, accessible other sources to keep warm in winter. And again, I like asking people when I see them, what would they do, how they do. And I have people living in the houses where they don't have any other option, for example, but then they would love to change to something less labor intensive.
Sure.
Younger generation. So my perspective, maybe it's not as big issue anymore, because I'm sure our generation would love to use less labor and in their houses and go through different routes, again, like retrofitting the houses. But then we're still left with the issues of horticulture.
Mm-hmm. Which is huge in the Republic of Ireland, yeah. Would have been involved in the horticultural industry back many years ago, and I was often involved in nurseries which were based around the Bog of Allen there, so I do know that tons and tons and tons of peat that was being used for horticultural products. I actually thought that had stopped, that they were buying in peat from abroad, somebody else's peat, to do the same thing, but maybe I'm wrong. Is that correct? Or
no, that's another. That's what they were
reinforcement.
Yeah, that was they were complaining about as well, because if we're restricting the use of the indigenous peat that we have, but we're anyway exporting it from abroad, what's the difference? That was the kind of the point of debate as well. Yeah.
Elena, you were involved in drafting the rebuttal for Save Our Sperrins, and your own scientific work focuses on measuring carbon emissions from Irish raised bogs and on peatland restoration monitoring. In your opinion, looking at the amount of peatland that will be impacted by the planned gold mine, what have you to say about this?
Do you repeat the question, and what exactly you're trying to say, and what kind of impact on peatlands?
Yes, for the work that that will require the removal of the peat, and then that they will replace it after they have done all their work what are your thoughts about this?
So it's just kind of simple things to remember is when peat is wet, it does not release any emissions. So anytime that peatlands has contact with the air, molecules of carbon that in peat, they connects to the oxygen, and that what goes into
Carbon dioxide.
CO2. So imagine like the work they do, they have to drain peatlands first, I presume, to dig it up. And then lots of peat is connected. It has access to the oxygen while they transfer it, while they put it to the new place. Yeah, so we're all losing carbon at every stage. And then peatlands is not uniform. So it's not peatland the same peat as we have like 3-meter depth. Or the peat we have at the surface. It has different carbon content. It has different properties. So it's kind of complicated when we move peat from one place to another place. So we literally don't have any evidence or any monitoring of what's happening. So science cannot say at the moment what exactly is going to happen and how
Right.
it's going to happen. But again, like remember, wet peat, no emissions. Dry peat, we have emissions.
And is it possible, and I know you said because it's changeable or it's variable and there are no models existing, but is it possible to say like 1 cubic meter of dry peat equals X number of emissions? Does that figure exist out there, or?
Yeah, so we can have a look. We have some numbers from land use. So when peatland is on the land, it emits certain amount of CO2. And then we have numbers for peat. Usually it's extracted for horticulture or for burning. So we can add up as well those numbers. There are methodologies existed in the National Inventory Report in the Republic of Ireland, so we actually can calculate once we know how much peat was taken and the area of the land it was taken from. Yes, it is possible to estimate the number.
Okay. And so another question I have, so my understanding of peat is that it acts like a giant sponge.
Yes.
What is it? The sphagnum moss, it absorbs how many times its own weight in water, or do we know that? And I know it absorbs a lot of moisture. Yeah. And we often, when I came to Oma first back in 1985-86, it was very heavy rain in October, November, and the Stroll River burst its banks and almost flooded up to the top of the first floor windows from the amount of water that was coming down, almost in kind of they call it the Virgin Plain. It's in a kind of a low area surrounded by hills, all of which have got upland, they've got peat bogs on top. Removing vast quantities of peat like this surely must have an impact on the lower hydrology and downstream hydrology. Have you any comments either of you would like to say about that? Or?
Yeah, definitely. Every time we do something with the peatland, disturb them, cutting drains, like pretty much if you remove peat, it's cutting a big, massive drain. So, and what happens is that this kind of sponge qualities, you kind of cut it in half and you have this open sponge. So all those features we value peatlands for, like absorb water after the heavy rain, kind of loses it and kind of goes to the opposite. So now
right.
Taking in all this heavy rainfall, heavy water, and release it slowly afterwards because it's been cut. All this water just goes through straight away, and because it's dry, peat is dry, we lose soil stability. We're talking about erosion. So all this water taking the peat with it. And that's what you see, this brown water, dissolved organic carbon. We're losing carbon, we're losing soil. And of course, it's affect a lot water quality. So it's literally the opposite process. Peatlands could act as artificial water treatment plant, pretty much.
Right.
Drained when they disturbed. It's opposite. They actually pollute water.
Right.
Another important thing to remember about uplands areas, it's landslides. It's when peat is dry, especially in the summer, the soil can crack. And once the heavy water goes into those cracks, they can make peatlands move. So that's why we can see those news about landslides.
That's really interesting, because where the proposed mine tailings heap is to be built is in a townland called Sheshkin Shul, and that means moving ground. It's actually to be put on top of a townland that's called moving ground. And these waste tailings from the mine, in the planning application, it is to be 17.5 stories high on top of a mountain, on top of a moving bog. In your knowledge of bogs and bog movement, what would you say about this?
Yeah, again, like, you have to be very careful with this, and it's really hard to predict. It's mountains areas, so it's not flat ground. It's peat lying on the bedrocks. Somewhere it's deeper, somewhere it's more shallow. So it's really hard to predict how, like, removing parts of it going to affect other areas, especially with such high slope. And it is getting a problem, as we can see. Like, we can hear news of landslides happening here and there. And then I would say about wildfires as well. With the dry peat in the summer, in Ireland, we weren't affected this so much so far, but it's happening more and more every year. We can see that, especially uplands areas where heather is dominant, we need to remember about this as well. And that will further worsen the problem. It will make peat drier, make peat crack. And then with the climate change, we get more extreme weather events. So we're talking about storms and stuff. And the combination of these two leads to all this soil instability and erosion, and to those
Slippage. Landslide. Yeah. I remember some years ago up the Glenelly Valley, there was, after very heavy rain, there was quite a large landslide down onto the road. You know, there was a number of farmers affected by it. And then, of course, over in Guabara and Donegal, they had a major landslide there as well. So all these, and the impact of wildfires as well, that's actually one thing that's I hadn't thought of, to be quite honest. And they are so prevalent now, wildfires, that and the peat gets burning. It's very hard to put out
It's called zombie fires, even when you don't see fire on the top.
Yeah.
It is still kept underneath the soil at the bottom of the pit. And once the weather is dry again, it just goes back up. And about the landslides, I wouldn't know much research been done on it. It's not exactly my area.
Yeah.
And it's quite new topic. So that will be hard to estimate, to find evidence, to do the assessment of what's going to happen with the land. What will happen with the area where the peat will be removed.
Right.
We don't have enough evidence to see what's going to happen with the peat when they put it in the new place, how it's going to affect carbon emissions. We don't have evidence either.
Let me come back to you, Alessandra. In relation to the law, what would better protection look like?
Yeah, so what I found in my, let's say, mapping of the different laws that apply to peatlands and, just, having a look at what the current response is what you find is that the law is often fragmented. So it's, it looks, so if it's, as I was saying, like, the legal instruments that at the moment better protect peatlands were thought of in order to protect biodiversity and the natural habitat in terms of wildlife and, just keeping the biodiversity alive. And then you have climate law, which is quite, it has this kind of almost kind of carbon tunnel vision. So we need to reduce emissions. We need to, so it needs to be more integrated. It needs to be to consider, because peatlands aren't, and peatlands are a great example of the interconnection as well, because they're not just carbon sinks, they're not just natural habitats, they are like all of these things together, including lived in environments and environments with which people have interacted. So that's what I kind of come down to, that the law needs to be more integrated, needs to consider the potential also clashes between these different objectives. For instance, and Elena maybe might jump in on this, but like there have been concerns around the building of, for instance, wind farms on peatlands. And so, you have wind farms that obviously try to achieve a certain climate goal, which is moving away from fossil fuels and having renewable energy. But then at the same time, you're building it on a bog, on a peatland site that is supposed to act as a carbon sink and have carbon stored. So, you have a clash of different objectives. And also just the idea that beside these different climate or environmental objectives that have to be considered together, but also the fact, as I said, of the human aspect, the human dimension and social and cultural dimension of peatlands. So in my research, as I said, I'm in between climate and environmental law and human rights law. So I do try to consider the human rights as well at stake in the process of managing peatlands. So, and, try to have a balanced approach where you consider, yes, of course, you need to prioritize at certain points the protection or the conservation of peatlands, and you need to make these difficult choices. But still considering that, they have been human-shaped spaces as well. And so in maybe either adopting the law or implementing the law, taking into account the human interests so the human rights of people that have been maybe impacted in the process of protection as well. So I think this holistic approach to the problem is really necessary. And that's what I try to promote in the research a lot, yeah.
Not so much legislation. It is mainly what I hear, what's happening. But yeah, I do see that often it's one-sided chat to some groups, and there is a lack of different, even opposition stakeholders to come together and being able to chat. There is no instruments to bring them together, and sometimes they even consider to be opposition. It's like people who want to restore peatlands and farmers for turf cutter who want to cut turf, and somehow they looked at being on different sides, but then they all come from the same community, and all they want is that community being good and living their best life with in the area. So this kind of the lack of dialogue, and instead of it kind of crushing them together while they aiming for the same goal. So that's maybe where we lack the instrument on how to open the conversation.
Okay. Do you believe by bringing all the different sides together that, and I'm not talking about the gold mine per se, but in relation to looking after the peat bogs in the Republic of Ireland, that there is a road forward. Everyone feels heard?
I feel that they heard in different places, but not in one room. It's hard to bring people. And I think it's mainly about social aspect, I'd say, rather than maybe legislation here, just people being able to talk to each other and how they present it in the media as well, and people open readiness to have a talk, because once you see people in the same room, suddenly there is a dialogue.
Yeah.
That's it would be nice to see. And maybe in your case, as well, just like people to people with different opinion, physically in the same place, and see how it would work.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. When people realise that they're working towards a common concern, and the common concern is perhaps to make a living or looking after their children or just to have a reasonable lifestyle, that's what everyone wants for themselves, you know. But I think as all of us human beings, we need to make room for everyone around that. But there is an overall thrusting argument, and it all comes back to our economic system. And instead of going for growth, we need to go for degrowth, which is, it's almost like a bad word or a bad concept, because it's impossible to keep our lifestyles going in the style that we're accustomed and not impact on our mountains, on our rivers, on our lakes, you know. But the things that are essential for us, for our lives, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the earth that supports us, has been thrashed for a slightly higher standard of life in however that shows up, because we need more of this, more of that to support it, you know. But what comes down to it is really understanding this is important. Our fresh water is important. Our air is important. And not contaminating the earth. So, and that's a grown-up conversation we all need to have. And then our laws then need to support that grown-up conversation.
It's just made me think of right to a healthy environment, which is something that, I highly support as a you know, so the right to a healthy environment is not, for instance, currently recognized in the European Convention of Human Rights or in Ireland. There has been development to that, but it's precisely this idea that we link a human right, which is normally, you know, whether you are impacted in your own physical or state or mental state, with the fact that we actually heavily rely on the environment. So there have been calls at international level, and then it's also development at judicial levels in the Republic of Ireland especially, but still we're not there. But it's highly important as a right to establish that connection between us human beings and the environment. So we need the environment to be healthy, because then we can be healthy as well. Not just to always think of the environment as something instrumental that we need to get something from, but at least it establishes common understanding of also how much we rely on it and how interconnected we are to it. Actually, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have the visit of the Special Rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment, so the United Nations Special Rapporteur to Ireland. So that's going to be a good conversation to have as well.
Yeah, we sent in the report to her. We know she's coming, but I know we're up in the north, but what happens a lot, what's happening is impacting transboundaries. So perhaps she will consider us, and I think we'd like to go down and meet her if that's possible, but we'll see what happens. Just on that, some years back, Fermanagh and Omagh District Council passed the Rights for Nature Bill within the council, as did Derry and Strabane. And the rights for nature is, if we uphold it, it would be a fantastic thing, because it would give us what we need, which to respect what is essential for life, for human life, really. But it's sort of been done and dusted and hung back in the cupboard again. It doesn't have any punch at the minute. Have you any comments? I don't know if any of the councils down in the Republic have passed the Rights for Nature bill within their council area, or
Not aware of whether it's been done at council level, but I know, for instance, that in 2022, there was a Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity laws in Ireland, and one of the recommendations of the Assembly was the recognition of both the right to a healthy environment and rights of nature within the Constitution. So that was I think, the most recent development in terms of how people also, people in Ireland think of, or the Republic anyway, think of, how important rights of nature are. And then it hasn't been really followed up since, or, the response, I think, if I remember correctly, was that, it's been discussed, because it's not something that you can do from, to recognize something in the Constitution. It's not something that you can do from, just very quickly. There has to be a process in place. So, it's in progress apparently, but yeah, so certainly it reflected like a call even from people to recognize rights of nature also in the Republic.
Yeah, it would be nice to see it happening. People often smile when I bring it up and say that'll never happen, but I often say, well, there was a time in the world when people thought it would be impossible to eradicate slavery, or there was a time in the world when women didn't have the vote.
So like it did happen in many parts of the world, and I think it's because of a different conception. But in the United States, in Australia, in Ecuador, so Latin America, many places have the rights of nature for rivers, or depending on what the concern was, forest rights and all of that. And I think we have a very different conception in Europe, much more anthropocentric. So we tend to be much more individualistic, and put the human first. But
yeah,
with distance, or we're influenced, and there is cross fertilization between across countries. So there is hope.
Yeah, we just we can live in hope. And actually, which brings me perfectly to my next question. Either of you can answer it, and both of you, I'd like you to answer. What gives you hope in the work that you do?
I think it's people.
Yeah.
Once you see people, once you see their enthusiasm, once you see that we all share the same ideas, the same goal, the similar vision, it's so inspiring. I think it's people.
And we kind of want to bring up, I agree. Maybe not everyone shares the same ideas, because we know there are people who have very different ideas, but, and so I think the challenge is bringing those people into the conversation, so not to become too polarized as a society. So try and kind of bridge the gaps and kind of bring everyone in the conversation. But I think a great aspect of the research that we both are doing is precisely this kind of connection. So we met through this early career researchers network and of peatland researchers. So we kind of realized there were different people working on peatlands from different disciplines. And so we became, Elena was the main person behind it to create this network of people. And we meet now, even though maybe some of us have finished their PhDs or are doing maybe something slightly different, but we still kind of are in touch, and we meet every now and then. And it's always events that have some relation to peatland. So we go to an art exhibition or installation, or we go to art performance or to the museum to see the bog bodies. But it created connection. And I think connections in this world are so important. And I think for me, that's the main hope. And that's why I love this job so much, because you try to do something good, and at the same time you're connected to people who are doing the same, and you share the same kind of hopes or concerns. And you still, and even though there's so much to be concerned about, but you still kind of keep going. And I think the connections you have really help. So I think we need to foster those connections.
Yeah, I agree with you. What we found in the campaign, the more we collaborated and the more we had solidarity across the world, across the earth, that the more it came back to us, and the wider and wider the ripples are created. And it's that cross-pollination of ideas and people, and stops us speaking into our own echo chamber, and that's what gives that's what gives me hope when I'm speaking to folk like you. So normally I'm just surrounded with the folk in the campaign, and then now I speak to people outside it, and it's so wonderful. There are people, lots of other people up to great stuff in the world, and that's what gives me hope. Really, it's a joy. So I think maybe we'll leave it on that note. It was a lovely conversation with both of you, and I want to thank you for your support of Save Our Sperrins in the past, and for coming on here in the podcast. And I look forward to meeting you maybe at the public inquiry in the near future. So thank you both.
Thank you so much for inviting us. Yeah, thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. I agree.
In that conversation, we heard how science, policy and legal thinking can sit together in academia and at the same time show up in the world of a public inquiry. It's been a heavy conversation at times, but also a hopeful one, because it shows what rigour and care can look like when people take climate change seriously. Thanks so much to Elena and Alessandra for their time and for the work they continue to do. If this conversation matters to you, if you think it's worth keeping alive, you can help by following the Sperrins podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or by sharing this episode with someone else who might listen. You'll also find the podcast on all the usual platforms and on the don'tmindus.com website. We'll be back again soon with another voice, another perspective, and the same questions we keep returning to. Thanks for taking the time to listen. For the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the earth that supports us, we hold the line.